The first thing the woman did when the cell door clanged shut was give a name that was not hers. She stood in a Chicago police station in the summer heat of 1903, dress wrinkled from a night gone bad, wrists rubbed red where the handcuffs had bitten. Caught stealing a pair of men's trousers from a department store, she faced the booking desk, lifted her chin, and told the officers she was Annie Oakley. The name moved through the room like a thrown stone. Annie Oakley, Little Sure Shot, the most famous woman with a rifle in the world. Men who barely looked up when drunks were dragged in now leaned closer. Someone paused with a pen above the blotter. They all knew the posters, the dime novels, the stories from Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. It was a lie. Her real name was Maud Fontanella, a burlesque performer with a habit and a string of petty arrests behind her. But that morning, she gambled that a legendary name might soften a judge, or at least make the papers pay attention to someone who lived life on the edges of the stage. The police took down the name as she gave it. The charge was theft, tied to cocaine use that had her moving in and out of trouble. When reporters from Chicago's papers stopped by the station, as they often did, someone mentioned that Annie Oakley had been arrested. A crime tied to a drug that was quickly becoming a national scandal, carried out by a woman who had built her fame on discipline and aim. It was the kind of story editors wanted. In the years before strict fact-checking, one bad assumption could become a national truth overnight. A local write-up about the supposed fall of Annie Oakley reached the desk of William Randolph Hearst's papers. From there, it was turned into something harsher and more dramatic, a piece that painted a once-beloved star now broken by addiction, stealing to feed a habit, dragged into court in disgrace. Within days, the story spread far beyond Chicago. Papers picked up the Hearst version and reprinted it almost word for word. In towns that would never see Buffalo Bill's Wild West, readers shook their heads over their morning coffee, believing that the most famous markswoman in America had fallen. Annie Oakley was nowhere near Chicago. At 43, she was living with her husband, Frank Butler, in Nutley, New Jersey. They had spent years traveling the world with Buffalo Bill's show, performing in front of royalty, and crowds so large the faces blurred together. Oakley had outshot men who had doubted her, split cards on edge, and taken aim at cigarettes held between Frank's lips. She had turned poverty and a hard childhood into a career that made her one of the best-paid performers of her time. By 1903, she had stepped away from constant touring. Injuries from a train accident in 1901 had slowed her and pushed her toward steadier work. She guarded her reputation carefully. To her, skill with a gun was tied directly to honor, and honor was something a woman in show business had to protect every day. The first hint that something had gone wrong came in the form of a newspaper clipping. Accounts describe Oakley opening a paper and seeing her own name attached to words she had never imagined: theft, cocaine, arrest. The story said she had been caught stealing to fund an addiction. There was no mention that the woman in custody was a performer who had given Oakley's name to the police. There was no sign that anyone had checked where Annie Oakley really was that week. For a woman who had spent decades building a public image of steadiness and self-control, the accusations cut deep. She had grown up poor in rural Ohio, lost her father to illness as a child, and learned to shoot not for spectacle, but to feed her family. The idea that strangers now pictured her as a thief, hooked on a drug, offended not only her pride, but the story of her life. Across the country, editors began to realize there was a problem. After checking, many papers discovered that the woman in the Chicago jail had only claimed to be Annie Oakley. Faced with their mistake, they printed retractions and apologies. Some did so quickly with clear corrections, but Hearst's organization held out. The original sensational story had sold well. The retraction would not. Oakley made a decision that would shape the rest of her decade. She would fight. She contacted lawyers, and began the slow process of filing libel suits, not just against Hearst, but against every newspaper that had repeated the false story. It was an enormous task. Over the next 6 years, she filed 55 suits and won or settled 54 of them. Each case meant travel, testimony, and the reopening of the same wound. The headline that showed the world a version of Annie Oakley that had never existed. In courtroom after courtroom, juries heard the difference between the real woman and the impersonator. On the one side was Oakley, small and controlled, with witnesses describing her discipline, her refusal to drink or gamble, and the years she had spent supporting her family and teaching women to shoot safely. On the other was the record of Maud Fontanella, a burlesque performer with a history of low-level crime, who had told police her name was Annie Oakley when she was arrested for theft tied to cocaine. The legal victories did not make Oakley rich. The money she collected in judgments was less than the total cost of the lawsuits. Travel, lawyers, and years in and out of court drained resources and time she could have spent performing or resting. But she kept going, case after case, determined to draw a line between her identity and the imposters. For Oakley, the point was not profit, it was the public record. As for Maud Fontanella, the trail after her Chicago arrest grows faint. The surviving accounts say little beyond the charge, the drug use, and the fact that she had posed as Annie Oakley. There is no detailed record of her later life, no official report that she was killed in a dramatic escape or died in some famous shootout. What remains is the moment when her choice of alias collided with someone else's hard-won reputation and set off a national scandal. By the time Oakley finished her last lawsuit around 1910, the scandal had largely faded. The true story had been established in courts across the country. The arrest in Chicago had involved another woman, and the claim that Annie Oakley had turned to crime for cocaine was false. Oakley went on performing for years, setting shooting records into her 60s and supporting causes she cared about, including teaching thousands of women how to handle firearms with care. She died in 1926 in Ohio. Her name once again linked more to skill and discipline than to the short-lived scandal that had tried to stain it. Her husband, Frank Butler, followed her in death just weeks later. Their lives and the years they spent protecting her reputation left a clear trail in court documents and news archives. The woman who had impersonated her did not leave as much behind. Beyond brief mentions in legal histories and in articles explaining how the false story began, Maud Fontanella appears mostly as a warning. What survived in the record was simple. She was not Annie Oakley, and the crime that made headlines had never belonged to the real markswoman at all. What happened in 1903 and the years that followed is not a tale of gunsmoke and a shootout on the frontier. It is the story of how a legendary figure from the American West had to ride into a different kind of fight, one fought with lawyers, affidavits, and sworn testimony instead of bullets. It began with an impostor in a city jail and ended with a record cleared, a reputation restored, and a reminder that even icons are vulnerable when the wrong name is written on the wrong line. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.